Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Shook. It's my pleasure to be discussing this topic with you on why animal welfare science must look at time. So, as we all know, time is at the heart of how any living creature experiences life. Affective states, whether positive or negative, will matter more or less depending on their intensity, but also critically on their duration. So it's not the same thing to be in a state of hunger just before a meal or for weeks, months, or a lifetime. And the same goes for any other affective experience that an animal may have, such as cold, fear, hunger, boredom, the pain of a fracture, frustration from the deprivation of motivated behaviors, and so on. So to give you an example that is closer to us, we can see here the description of the pain of a bone fracture as narrated by someone who has gone through this experience. And we can see that the impact of this pain on the patient is very much a function of the intensity of the pain in the vertical axis and the duration of the pain on the horizontal axis. So there's very intense pain immediately in the hour after the fracture, then somewhat less intense pain during the inflammation period, but still it's painful. Then the pain gradually subsides as the callus starts forming and the bone is remodeled. Now, the same logic also applies to animals. We have here the case of an egg-laying hen that has just suffered a keel bone fracture, and the impact of this fracture on the welfare of the hen is also a function of the intensity of the pain and the duration of the pain. So we can expect a very similar pattern to what we observed in the case of the human patient. We could also have another example, for example, a hen that suffered an acute fatal episode of egg peritonitis that got infected and the hen dies from septic shock. So in this case, there is some discomfort in the beginning before infection sets in. Then pain gets very, very high during sepsis. It's a very painful condition and then subsides abruptly as the hen gets into septic shock and dies. So obviously affective states are modulated by a number of factors, but intensity and time are key factors. So we can think of what would be the worst suffering in the world. And one good answer to this would be that with the longest possible duration and the highest possible intensity. Now, time-based metrics of well-being haven't been used much in the animal welfare sciences, but they have been used a lot in other areas such as global health from where we come from. One of them, for example, is the DALY, Disability Adjusted Life Years, which measures the time of healthy life lost to disease or to premature death. So, for example, here we have the case of a person from birth to death which experiences in the red squares here some episodes of disease, and in the last bout the person dies at 60 years of age, so 10 years before the average life expectancy for this demographic group. And the DALY here in this case is the measure of the years lost to disease weighted by a disability weight, which how much the disabled made the person unhealthy. So 5 years here in a diseased state with a disability weight of 50% would mean 2.5 years lost. This is calculated for all the disease episodes over the life of an average person with this disease. And the DALY here is simply the sum of the years lost to disease, so 2.5, 1.5, and 3.5, which is 7.5, and the years lost to premature death due to the disease. So DALY is 17.5 years. And by having this universal metric, which is time, you can compare very different conditions, injuries, diseases, any problems you want to look at in terms of the time they cause the person to lose to the disease you're analyzing. You can compare different age groups, different locations, different, demographics, evolution of the burden of the diseases over time, and set priorities for interventions, for funding, for research, etc. So with that in mind, we understand that in the animal welfare sciences, a biologically meaningful metric of welfare, of suffering, that is amenable to comparisons, a universal metric such as a time-based measure, is needed to quantify and compare the impact of very different welfare problems, policies, living conditions, to enable integrating animal welfare quantitatively into social, environmental, and economic analysis, and to raise awareness about how much suffering is embedded in each unit of animal products, in each kilo, in each liter, in each egg, with a metric that anyone can understand, that is not abstract. So based on our experience in global health, we developed the cumulative pain framework, which measures the time in unpleasant negative affective states. And we use the term pain as a shorthand for any felt negative affective state. So time in pain of different intensities enables comparing very different outcomes, very different hazards through their effects in terms of the time the animal spends in pain, or the average member of a population spends in pain. For intensity, we use 4 discrete categories of pain intensity, from annoying, which is simply a discomfort, to excruciating. These categories are defined by tight criteria. Don't worry, I will not read this for you, but mostly the level of disruption in terms of behavior. This is one criteria. The expected effect of drugs, painkillers, psychotropics on behavior, effects in terms of attention, cognitive performance, and so on. So you can read the definitions in the website if you're interested. And we have a notation system which we call pain track, where we make hypotheses about the duration of the pain associated with a welfare challenge and the intensity of the pain explicit in this notation system. So for example, here we have a pain track for the case of a Q-bone fracture in laying hens. And the probability that the pain belongs to each of these categories of pain intensity is informed by multiple indicators. So behavior indicators, the effect of drugs on pain and behavior and physiological markers, physiology, immunology, knowledge of the neurological system associated with the structure that was affected, tests of preference, of motivation, evolutionary reasoning on the adaptive importance of the pain of that negative affective state associated with the hazard, evidence from closely related species in terms of pain, and so on. So we have this hypothesis here with uncertainty intervals, and the better the evidence, the narrower our interval of uncertainty, both for duration and for the probability that pain belongs to each of these categories of intensity. And once we have the hypothesis for intensity and duration, they are converted to time in pain by simply multiplying this probability here by the duration of the segment. And once you add up all the time in pain of the different intensities, you have the cumulative time in pain due to a fracture in this case. We have applied this framework to answer a number of questions regarding the welfare of egg-laying hens. The results are available in this book. And questions such as, would it be possible that due to the greater frequency of challenges such as aggression, fractures, infectious diseases in cage-free operations, welfare of the hens would be worse as compared to caged operations? Or even if welfare is better in cage-free environments, how much better is it? In the case of broilers, we ask questions such as how much suffering can be averted by setting genetic limits to the growth rate of broiler chickens, or would a longer life in the case of slower growing breeds, under conditions that are still better but far from ideal, lead to more suffering because the chickens live a longer life? And to answer these questions, we investigated a number of welfare challenges that laying hens and broiler chickens go through: lameness, behavior deprivation, fractures, injuries, thermal stress, cardiovascular conditions, infectious diseases, and so on. And in doing so, and because we had to look at both indicators of intensity of the pain and duration of the pain, it became very clear to us that very little attention in the welfare sciences has been paid to understanding the duration of the welfare challenges that the animals undergo, so how long they last, the timing of onset of these challenges, so when they emerge, and the evolution or clinical evolution of these challenges, so how quickly they progress and how they progress. There is very, very little information for many of the welfare challenges that are commonly investigated in the welfare sciences. So in this table we have some examples. For example, regarding egg peritonitis, which is both a chronic condition in survivors and a fatal condition, is the most important production disease in poultry. There's very little to no knowledge on the duration of the pain associated with it, on the duration of chronic pain in survivals, how quickly it progresses, how long the hen affected by it spends in critical stages. In terms of sepsis, this is the main cause of carcass condemnation in broiler chickens, and yet there is very little information on the clinical evolution of sepsis, even though this is an extremely painful condition, but it's a neglected condition in the animal welfare sciences. We don't know the time it takes for the hen to die from sepsis when loss of consciousness happens. In terms of keel-bone fractures in laying hens, the duration of pain, the clinical evolution of pain, inflammatory case, callus formation, and etc. We don't know much about it. In terms of injurious packing, fatal cannibalistic attacks, vent packing bouts, we don't know, in the case, for example, of a fatal cannibalistic attack, how long it takes for the victim to die. So what is the typical duration of these attacks? We don't know. The frequency of the bouts, the duration of the bouts, is it like a few seconds, a few minutes, many minutes? In terms of gait impairing conditions, lameness, when does it happen? I know it's a multifactorial condition, but we don't know much about the duration of each of the phases of lameness, how long each broiler, for example, spends in each gait score before it progresses to the next one. The same goes for cardiac abnormalities, the main cause of death, so sudden death, ascites, and the expression of motivated behaviors. What are the changes in the time budget over the production cycle as the hen or the broiler gets older? So there are many research gaps associated with the time spent in different conditions, when conditions emerge, how long they last, how quickly they progress. And these gaps are not only present in terms of poultry research, but also in other areas of animal welfare research on pigs, fish, etc. And it's very, very critical to understand these questions related to time, to onset, to duration. I'll give you an example. For example, we know that when we have less risk factors for a disease, let's say for cardiovascular diseases, for diabetes, etc., the onset of the disease is likely later on in life. So in the case of production animals, farm animals, we have the later onset of chronic disease and injuries relative to slaughter age when you have better genetics. For example, when you have a slower growing breed. And with the later onset of disease, relative to the slaughter age, you're going to have a shorter time spent in pain until slaughter in the case of chronic conditions, because the disease emerged much later in life. You're going to have less time for disease progression. So what this means is that the disease will probably be less severe. It will not reach the most severe stages. And as a consequence, less individuals, because it takes more time for the disease to emerge, less individuals will develop the problem. So you have reduced duration, reduced intensity, less severe disease, and reduced prevalence. And as a consequence, reduced suffering. So understanding the effect of genetics, for example, or environmental conditions on the onset, on the timing of onset of disease is critical in this sense. And although the idea is not to present the results of the research conducted with this method, some very interesting findings emerge when we look at the effects of, when we consider the duration of the welfare challenges in animal welfare analysis. So, for example, our estimates show that chronic hunger in fast-growing female breeders, broiler breeders, is possibly the greatest source of physical pain for any farm chicken, including egg-laying hens and broiler chickens. And the case sepsis, for example, and the diseases leading to sepsis, such as egg peritonitis in breeders and laying hens, is possibly the greatest source of excruciating pain in these animals. So many interesting things emerge when we take time, duration into account. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this talk, and we are available for questions.